Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Tuesday the 26th of August 2025. One of the more interesting stories brewing out here on the West Coast is around the military-industrial digital complex, as we might think of it. The company that's most associated with it is Peter Thiel's Palantir, although it's not really Peter Thiel's Palantir since he doesn't actually work there anymore. He's just one of the co-founders. The Economist wrote an interesting piece earlier this month asking whether Palantir might be the most overvalued firm of all time. Its stock has risen dramatically. And in fact, The Economist, in their wise way, compare Palantir's current exuberance and the new military-industrial complex exuberance to Cisco in the dot-com boom of the 1990s. Although, as it happens, since that Economist piece, Palantir stock has plunged a little bit. They're probably, or a lot of the investors on Wall Street are probably reading The Economist. Nonetheless, it speaks of a growing threat of a new kind of military-industrial complex emerging in America post-Eisenhower one. Lots of people are concerned. It's not just Palantir, but Palantir is, so to speak, the pin-up for this new world. Robert Reich, great critic, I think, of both the previous and the current military-industrial complex, worked in the Clinton administration, even wrote a Substack piece asking how we can stop Peter Thiel's Palantir. One man who's been giving a lot of thought to the new complexion of our military-industrial economy is my guest, Ben Freeman. He's the co-author, very interesting new book. It's getting published in November, in a couple of months. It's written with William Hartung, and William will appear on the show in November to talk specifically about the book. It's called The $1 Trillion War Machine. Ben's day job is at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, where he researches corruption in the military economy, and he's joining us from his home in Flagler Beach, Florida. Ben, I apologize for the rather long-winded introduction. What's your take on Palantir? Is it something we should be carefully watching?
Yes. Well, first, great to be here. Thank you for having me on. But I think it's very important to keep an eye on Palantir, and not just for investors. I think for your average American citizen who's worried about their privacy, their civil liberties, not having a government that knows everything about them at all times. I think for everybody, they should be a little bit concerned about Palantir, and particularly its role in this kind of new age military-industrial complex. As you said, this is a company that's been around for a couple decades now. But we're really just seeing it come to prominence in national security circles and in defense contracting, getting a historic $10 billion contract just a few weeks ago announced. So we're seeing it rise to this extraordinary level of prominence. And so I think in addition to the investors, I think there's very serious privacy concerns and civil liberties concerns as well.
Not only that, but of course, the kinds of weapons, both metaphorical and literal, that Palantir seems to be encouraging is certainly not something I'm guessing at guys like you at the Quincy Institute are particularly thrilled with. Last year, I'm not sure if you've seen the new book by Raj. Well, it was last year. It was a new book by Raj Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff. It was called Unit X, how the Pentagon and Silicon Valley are transforming the future of war. They're cautiously optimistic about some of the innovations that Silicon Valley is bringing to the Pentagon. Have you had a look at that book, Ben?
I did. I quite enjoyed it. We mention it actually in our own book, and I think your description of it is really spot on. It's a quiet optimism that Kirchhoff and Raj Shah have too. And they're two folks that have been inside the building there at the Pentagon and kind of helped to spur along this technological revolution. So they've got some war stories, and both I know Raj fought in wars, but
Raj is an ex-serviceman, so I thought it was a particularly good. It wasn't a good interview; it was a good conversation. They're both very good.
Yeah, and Raj, both of them, the stories they had about the Pentagon, the way the Defense Department was buying weapons, was just absurd, and kind of pointed to how the Pentagon has this antiquated system. It's designed; it almost has this like autoimmune function that repels innovation. So when these guys came in and tried to get Silicon Valley more involved in the DoD procurement process, they got swatted down at every possible opportunity. And so that they really had to fight to get a better technology into the building. I think what we're seeing now in these first months of the Trump administration is that work kind of coming to fruition, and DoD opening its doors more than it ever has before to Silicon Valley. That's not to say it's all necessarily, for the best, but I think a lot of what those guys put in place, is at least pushing the defense acquisition process in a good direction.
You use the A word, Ben, to describe the Pentagon. Absurd. Of course, the movie that most captured the absurdity of the Pentagon is a real classic, the 1964 movie Dr. Strangelove, featuring the great Peter Sellers. Has anything changed in the last 60 years? Is the Pentagon just as absurd, just as incompetent, just as mad as, of course, Kubrick's interpretation of the Pentagon may be slightly exaggerated, sure. May not be exact, certainly wasn't empirical, but some of the characters who were presented in Dr. Strangelove were real people who, in fact, were trying to encourage JFK to start a nuclear war against Russia in the Bay of Pigs crisis, and then in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So this wasn't entirely unrealistic. Has anything changed in the last 60 years when it comes to the Pentagon?
In some ways, no. To your point of Dr. Strangelove, earlier today, I was just reading an article by a prominent think tank scholar who was effectively making an argument that to solve the Russia-Ukraine peace process, the U.S. needs to get more aggressive with nuclear weapons. To exactly Dr. Strangelove's point. Who was
Sellers? It was that famous aircraft general, so famous I can't remember his name, but he was literally portrayed, and he was a guy who encouraged JFK to start a nuclear war over the missile crisis.
Right.
What was his name? I've forgotten his name.
Oh, I forget his name too. But you fast forward to 2025, and we still have people who are making those same kind of statements about wars that are going on right now. So, in some sense, we're still back in that crazy Dr. Strangelove paradox time. What has changed, and what Bill and I point out in our book, The $1 Trillion War Machine, is that in that time period since Dr. Strangelove happened, you could never imagine the military-industrial complex then is just a shell of what it is now. The tools they have in their influence arsenal are so much more expansive. The amount of money that they're pumping in to influence people, to write checks to them, it's extraordinary. The money coming out of the Pentagon right now is unprecedented. The percentage of it going to those contractors, all of that is unprecedented. Their whole stranglehold on U.S. society now, it's worse than it ever was in Dr. Strangelove's time. Even in the time of Ike, when President Eisenhower gives that cross of war speech where he coins the term military.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic, of course, because Eisenhower himself was part of it. He was a military general who was persuaded to go into politics. Both parties rather fancied him.
Right. And as we documented in our book too, he was also a big proponent of using Hollywood. He's one of the first proponents of using Hollywood as part of the military-industrial complex propaganda apparatus too. So as you know, in public, you sort of got one Eisenhower who was, saying all the right things, of course, about the military-industrial complex, but that underlied that he came from that system as well.
And of course, Eisenhower inherited the Pentagon, if that's the right way of putting it, from Harry Truman, who dropped a couple of nuclear weapons on Japan. So it's not just one party that does this wrong. One of the things that strikes me, Ben, about this growth of a new digital military-industrial complex, companies like Palantir are so central to it, is on the one hand, America has more and more weapons of one kind of mass destruction or another. And yet, on the other hand, it's increasingly unable or unwilling or just incompetent in terms of dealing with major crises in the world, from Gaza, of course, to Ukraine, to the Korean Peninsula. You at Quincy focus on a lot of these areas. So is there a connection between, shall we say, overarmament or overinvestment in weapons of mass destruction and increasingly incompetent or pathetic foreign policy?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And if you look at where the U.S. prioritizes itself when it comes to foreign policy, it's overwhelmingly in this militarized direction. For the first time ever, we just hit $1 trillion military budget. And yet, at the same time, we're gutting other tools that can solve conflicts. The State Department's getting gutted. Of course, USAID is effectively no more now. So, the diplomacy development side of foreign policy engagement, it is all but being eliminated. And you're seeing the costs of that right now in the Ukraine, Russia conflict, for example, where we have a president in Donald Trump, who claims over and over that he wants to find a way to get to a peace plan in this conflict. Yet he doesn't really have the people to do it. A lot of folks at the State Department who had this diplomatic capability, they've been shuttered or at least shut out of this process. And so, when you have a country that's willing to commit $1 trillion to its military and isn't really committed to much of all to diplomacy, it's unsurprising that it's going to be wildly ineffective at solving conflicts peacefully.
Yeah, and again, there's this tragic paradoxical connection between the supposed parsimony of the US, articulated perhaps most clearly by J.D. Vance, unwillingness to invest anything in overseas conflicts unless they directly involve the United States, particularly when it comes to a conflict like Ukraine, and this massive amount of money going into weapons that generally never get used. It's something that if Kubrick was around now, I'm sure he would make a remake of Strangelove with all that incorporated. But to be fair, I mean, I'm guessing you and most of the other folks at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft are certainly more on the left than the right, probably more sympathetic to the Democrats and the Republicans. And of course, we could turn this conversation, Ben, as so many conversations these days, into just bashing Trump. But that would probably be a little unfair, wouldn't it? Is this shall we say, a bipartisan problem, as much a problem with the Trump people as it was with Biden or even Obama?
Absolutely. I mean, when it comes to the militarization of U.S. foreign policy, it is absolutely a bipartisan problem. If you look back, you think of, everybody does like to revile Trump, as you're saying here.
And I'm as eager to revile him as anyone, I'm sure you are, but it becomes a bit pointless, I think, after a while. Yeah,
but what we realize at the Quincy Institute, and just for the record, the Quincy Institute, it is a bipartisan organization. We call it a transpartisan organization. We have good friends on staff from the right side of the aisle, good folks from the left. I'm much more of a centrist myself, but we do have folks from both sides.
So you're she and he at the same time, aren't they?
Sure. But what we've seen over the years, you go back and you look at President Biden's record. This is a guy who was selling arms sales to the rest of the world at a record clip. You look back at the Obama administration too. President Obama, he got a Nobel Peace Prize, and then he oversaw in the surge in Iraq and Afghanistan the highest level of military spending we've seen in the U.S. since World War II. More than the peaks of the Iraq, or more than the peaks of the Korean, Vietnam War, you name it. And so the Nobel Peace Prize winner technically has the title for the largest military budgets controlling for inflation. So it doesn't matter whether there's a Republican or a Democrat in the White House or even in Congress or the Senate. Most folks from both parties, they're supporting military solutions. And the reason they are is because a lot of these folks are kind of in on this con. They're in districts that have a lot of jobs that defense contractors are planting in their districts. And they're also taking huge money in campaign contributions from these defense contractors. So what we have is this system that pumps more than half of the Pentagon's total budget to contractors. And then the contractors deal that money out to all these different people who get bought in on this larger military industrial complex. And then it just becomes this self-perpetuating system that doesn't make us safer, but it costs us more and more money every year.
Yeah, and two of the companies that I know you particularly focus on, it won't come as a surprise, I think, to many of our listeners and viewers, Lockheed Martin and Boeing, which is perhaps America's most inefficient company. I'm not sure if it's most corrupt, but certainly it's most inefficient. I take your point, and that's the key focus in the book, in your trillion-dollar war machine, how runaway military spending drives America into foreign wars and bankrupts us at home. But some people might argue, Ben, that it doesn't drive America enough into foreign wars. It should be more involved perhaps in Ukraine or even in Gaza, in terms of at least putting the brakes on an ally in a war that is increasingly looking like a genocide. Does there need to be, I take your point about Lockheed Martin and Boeing, and I don't think anyone's going to argue with you on that front, that everyone's in on this scam. But the fact that Obama and Biden, particularly Biden, who's a sort of, seems to be a Cold War dinosaur, does it really require more than just rethinking budgets? It requires a profound rethinking of America in the 21st century world. Yeah,
I think that's right. And it requires a rethinking of, what our role is on the international stage. Do we want to be the supreme power in the world? Do we want to play world policeman and, be at the center of every conflict that's out there? We tried that for a while. It didn't really go well. And, it cost us a lot of blood and treasure along the way. And so I think in this multipolar world that we're in, we've got to recognize that we don't have to be the sole police officer to the world. We can work with our allies and partners. We can engage in diplomatic talks, and we can find non-peaceful solutions to a lot of these problems. But that's not really where we're investing our money right now. And really, in my line of work, it's the follow the money business. And if you follow the money, you'll be able to see where the policy is going. And unfortunately, our money is going to war, and so then our strategy then becomes a way to create reasons for war, or getting at least close to war. And then the cases you mentioned, Ukraine, Israel, and elsewhere, though we haven't been, well, certainly with Iran, we were directly involved there. With Ukraine, we haven't had boots on the ground, but we've had tens of billions of dollars in weaponry that's been flowing from the U.S. to Ukraine. And in a lot of cases, we've seen it's the wrong weaponry. It's not stuff that they need. For example, we sent them tanks, and send tanks to the front lines in Ukraine. They just become a target. They just get destroyed by drones, and they put Ukrainian soldiers at risk. So in all these conflicts, whether we've been involved or not, they're also an indictment on our system that's producing the wrong weapons, and they're still in a Cold War mindset that doesn't really help keep us safe or other countries safe.
Ben, we've done many shows on dark money, on the global corruption in the world economy, which is mostly fueled, it would seem, by Russian money of one kind or another, certainly the darkest of the dark money. And Chinese government, perhaps even their entrepreneurs, are also involved. Given, particularly in Trump's America, this very odd relationship that the US has with Russia, is there a connection between an increasingly dysfunctional American foreign policy and a global economy increasingly run on dark money?
It's a fair question. I think right now we're this administration. I know I said I wasn't going to poke fun at the Trump administration, but now I'm going to poke fun at. One of the real challenges and frustrations that I have with the Trump administration is its willingness to invite foreign influence into the U.S. policymaking process. And Trump has made no bones about it, that the transactional nature of everything he does when it comes to foreign policy. And, that's why it's not at all surprising to see the Qatari $400 million jet, these side deals that his company has with Saudi Arabia, with the UAE, these Trump golf courses going up all over the Middle East. It's very clear that this administration is very willing to be transactional. And with the rise of Bitcoin in this space too, and other cryptocurrencies, I think
that's a really important angle that I'm not sure enough people are addressing.
I completely agree, and I think this is so hard to track and follow when you're talking about dark money, and it's so easy to effectively use crypto for de facto bribes, and not just in the U.S., around the world too. So I do think that a big part of that is why Americans have grown incredibly distrustful of their foreign policy. And I think with reason. You ask the average American, about their stance on, what kind of foreign policy they'd like to conduct. And the average American, they like the old saying goes, they want to walk softly but carry a big stick. They don't want to engage in those conflicts. They do want to have a strong military, but they really prefer for the U.S. to stay out of conflicts. But that's not the foreign policy they get. They get this hyper-aggressive foreign policy that mostly benefits special interest and not the average American citizen.
This is your world, Ben. So I assume you talk to lots of generals and military analysts off the record. Is there a degree of frustration within the Pentagon amongst smarter, perhaps more responsible generals, maybe younger generals, not the Dr. Strangeloves, but the reverse of Dr. Strangeloves, who would like to see a cleaner, more efficient Pentagon and new military, even, I'm not sure they'd use this term, military industrial complex. What do they want to see? The more responsible military figures in Washington, D.C.?
It's a great question, Andrew. And yes, we talk to a lot of these folks. I teach classes to defense budget folks too. I think the best people to talk to if you want to learn about wasteful spending at the Pentagon are people who are at the Pentagon. And I think the very best people to talk to are these 05, 06s. You want to talk about your lieutenant colonels and colonel, folks who have been around the building for a while, but haven't reached that top upper echelons of generals and flag officers, because they've seen it firsthand. They've been in the room to see how broken some of these systems are. And if you get them over a beer or two, they'll tell you these stories off the record, but publicly, they can't say a lot of this stuff because it'll jeopardize their future careers, their post-retirement careers. Because what ultimately happens then is that these defense contractors that we've been talking about this whole time, the Boeings, the Lockheed Martins, they pride themselves on filling their ranks with these former DoD officials.
Right, who they, of course, pay very well.
They pay them very well. They get these lucrative contracts, board seats, all this sort of stuff to pay them well. So that's not when you want to talk. You want to talk to them when they're still there in the Pentagon and, they haven't yet, bought into those upper ranks yet. And then they can really tell you about all the wasteful spending that's going on, all the brokenness that's happening there. And, it was such a shame, earlier this year we had the Department of Government Efficiency, which some of us, national security analysts, were really hoping they would take a serious look at the Pentagon, but they did nothing. They did next to nothing when it came to the Pentagon. And so we just really didn't see any of the fat get cut at the Pentagon. Instead, we've just seen this surge in spending that's only going to exacerbate the problem.
Is there a great deal of fear or excitement, or I'm guessing a mixture of both, about AI as this new technology which is about to change everything? I mean, Palantir, of course, isn't an AI company, but it no doubt will use AI more and more centrally, as so many Silicon Valley startups, and indeed there's a whole sector now of AI military startups out here. What's the feeling on AI, and how do you see it in your book and at Quincy in terms of a technology that might enable the cleaning up of this corruption, of making the American military more efficient and transparent?
Yeah, I was just in an AI training 2 weeks ago with a lot of DoD folks, both active duty service members and civilians, and I can tell you it was non-confident or non-classified training, and so the vibe we got from that was that AI is both seen as an opportunity and a risk. It became clear by the end of it that some lower level positions that are being done in the U.S. military right now could be replaced by AI. That became abundantly clear as we got through a lot of these examples. And me as an outsider in the think tank space, I was looking at AI and thinking about some positions in my field which could be replaced by AI too. But then I think we also saw it, the opportunities of it, that, it could expedite research. You can get basic things done a lot quicker and a lot faster. So there's a lot of imperfections there, but I think the opportunities for both DoD's usage and, the public sector uses are enormous for the AI. There's no question about that. I think the real concern that we have at Quincy, and Bill and I talk about in the book related to AI, is when we start using AI in these what are called automated kill chains, where we take the human out of the loop and we say we're going to let AI make the decisions on whether a lethal strike is conducted or not. That can be very, very problematic.
Yeah, exactly. What could go wrong with that?
Right.
Especially when it comes to weapons of mass destruction.
Right. But even lower level stuff, we're hearing from, some horror stories, of course, from Gaza, but we're hearing some of those horror stories are being created through the use of AI and through targeting gone awry that's powered by AI, mistaking a face of someone for somebody who's in Hamas and then ending up killing civilians there through the use of AI and through bad facial recognition technology. So I think, that sort of, cautionary tale tells us that we're certainly not at a place where we should be using that kind of technology for those kill chain purposes. But I do think that there's plenty at the DoD where AI could be useful for efficiencies.
Yeah, it's all a bit chilling. We did a show a couple of months ago with Ed Luce, who has this wonderful new biography of Brzezinski, and who was the national security guy in the Carter administration. He tells, and particularly Ed writes about a particularly chilling moment when someone called Brzezinski in the middle of the night saying there was a Soviet nuclear strike, and he had a few minutes to determine whether to call the president and respond. And in those minutes, he determined that he wouldn't move his kids or his wife because they were all going to die anyway. And then, of course, after a few minutes, it proved to be a mistake. But technology is always capable of these catastrophic mistakes, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And that brings up another issue that we have right now. I didn't even mention with deep fakes.
Oh my God. Yeah. I never even thought of that. God, yeah. That adds to the eerie, chilling nature of all this.
I mean, yeah, in a couple minutes, you and I, with just a few clicks, we can create a deep fake that looks and sounds a heck of a lot like JD Vance, and
we may be fakes now, Ben. You and I. This is produced by Robert Reich and the Guardian newspaper.
It could be. It could be.
Yeah, and of course, I assume, and this would be, at least in my view, as an amateur, a smart investment of money. I assume lots of Pentagon money is going into technologies which will distinguish between fakes, deep fakes, and deep reality. Is the Pentagon awake? Is it aware that it needs to reinvent itself technologically? And in that sense, what Raj Shah and Christopher Kirchhoff write about in Unit X,
Right.
this cooperation between the Pentagon and Silicon Valley might actually be quite wise.
Right, right. And you know, as they point out there, and I think to your question, the Pentagon is well aware of this. And you sort of see it starting right now, this AI arms race. And, you know, it's both an offensive and a defensive race. You know, how do you protect yourself from this technology? And, you know, how do you use it for offensive reasons? And what Shaw and Kershaw point out in that book, too, is that DoD had historically been an acquisition of a major weapon system could take more than a decade to occur. And, you know, when you start to think about the pace of technological change in Silicon Valley, we're doubling our computational power every 2 years, if not faster. The Pentagon acquisition system was just so outdated, so behind, that it just wasn't keeping up with any of the new technology we have. And again, fortunately, the Pentagon is realizing that. I think my hope and my co-author's hope is that we still have the guardrails in to say, like, all right, we want to speed up all this stuff, but we still want to make sure we're doing the testing. You know, we're checking all the boxes to make sure we're not creating some kind of doomsday Dr. Strangelove sort of device here.
Well, finally, Ben, a very interesting conversation, and I'm excited to interview your colleague, your co-author, William Hartung, on the book itself. We'll talk more specifically about that. The book is out on the 11th of November, so we'll do another show in November with Hartung. But we've got an upcoming book. I'm not sure, again, if you're familiar with the work of the Washington Post columnist Shadi Hamid, who's, again, a card-carrying progressive, and he has a new book coming out called The Case for American Power, which is exactly as you imagine it from the title. What's your take on a case, not Hamid's case? You probably haven't read the book yet, but is there a case for American power in the 21st century, and how does it tie in with the work you do at the Quincy Institute and all these terrible conflicts now around the world?
Yeah, I think there certainly is. I mean, you know, when you look at the sort of America's traditional role in the world, and was for a long time a peace broker. You know, of late in the past few decades, we've been heavily involved in many military conflicts around the world. But there is, I think, a proud American legacy of, you know, providing peace and stability to the world, and you know, being a source of, you know, that beacon on the hill that we all heard about. And so I think, you know, there's
power in a, maybe not Pacific power, but certainly power in not necessarily an explicitly militaristic sense.
Right. And, you know, there's a moral power too. There's an idealistic power. You know, there's a power of, you know, being a good representative democracy, and, you know, sending that message to the world to empower the people around the world. So I think there is a case for American power. I think right now that conversation about what American power should be is just so skewed by the war profiteers, this war machine that we talk about. I don't think we're having an honest conversation about what American power really should look like beyond this militarism that we see today.
Well, it's a conversation that's enormously important, and we will continue it in a couple of months with your co-author, William Hartung. Ben and Hartung are the authors of The $1 Trillion War Machine. It's out in a couple of months, but an important message and a great conversation, Ben, and I hope we'll stay in contact. Maybe we'll get some other people from Quincy to talk more about the challenges and problems of American foreign policy in the world in 2025. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. Take care.